The Almanack of Naval Ravikant is easily one of the three most impactful books I have ever read. I've probably read it from front to back around 10 times, and I've gone back through my highlights more times than I can count. And I'm not saying that to brag. It really does not matter how many times you read a book. Reading something 10 times does not automatically mean you understood it. I mention it because it shows how much knowledge is packed into these pages. Every time I return to the book, I notice an idea or a connection that I missed before. The book was compiled and edited by Eric Jorgensen from Naval's interviews, essays, podcasts, and other public conversations. Eric has also written other great books and has a great blog, which I'll link to in the description. But really, if you're ambitious and love to learn, this is a book you need to read. There is an idea, and I've seen it attributed to Nassim Taleb, that truly great books are difficult to summarize. Their ideas stretch across too many boundaries, and they are too information dense to compress into a few simple points without losing something important. That is definitely true of this book. And I'm not going to try to summarize it. That is actually the entire point of this podcast. With amazing books like this, I think it's much more valuable to pull out 3 to 5 of the most important ideas, examine them deeply, connect them to other disciplines, and show how you can use them to make better decisions in your own life. So there will be no traditional book summaries here, but I will say that the Almanack of Naval Ravikant spans 3 of the most important subjects in life: wealth, health, and happiness. So if you're interested in improving any one of these, and I imagine you probably are, you would do well to read this book. Now, let's get into the ideas. The first big idea is leverage. This is one of the first ideas presented in the Almanack of Naval Ravikant, and quite honestly, I think it's one of the most important ideas you need to understand in order to understand reality. Its applicability is incredibly wide. It shows up in technology, mathematics, statistics, engineering, investing, business, and many other disciplines. Deeply understanding leverage will allow you to understand the world much better because the world is driven by non-linear outcomes. Understanding leverage is one of the first steps towards understanding that. And don't worry, the concept of non-linearity is something I plan to address in a future episode, so hold on for that one. There's a famous quote commonly attributed to Archimedes. It's, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." When I talk about leverage, I'm not necessarily talking about financial leverage like debt-to-equity ratios. I am also not talking about having leverage over another person in a negotiation or a situation. What I'm talking about is any tool, system, or strategy that multiplies the output of your effort, time, capital, or judgment without requiring a proportional increase in input. You get outsized results from the same amount of work or sometimes even less work. Leverage is a mechanism that breaks the linear relationship between input and output. More importantly, leverage acts as a force multiplier for your judgment. The way leverage is discussed in the book is almost engineering focused, and I think this quote from Naval describes it well. He says, "Over time, sadly or fortunately, the thing I got really good at was looking at businesses and figuring out the point of maximum leverage to actually create wealth and capture some of that created wealth." Let me use a very simple example. So, suppose one worker can make one widget. The ratio of input to output is 1-to-1, and that's relatively low leverage, like in a factory, suppose, or something like that. So now suppose that the company invests in new technology and the same worker can make 4 widgets in the same amount of time. Now the ratio is 1-to-4. The company has increased its output 4 times without increasing its labor input 4 times. That is leverage. And here's another simplified example. So imagine you have 2 real estate agents, each spend 6 months closing a deal. One agent sells a $400,000 house and the other agent sells a $10 million house. If both earn a 3% commission, the agent selling the $10 million house earns 25 times more from the transaction. Now, of course, selling a $10 million house may require more skill and experience. The example is intentionally simplified, but it illustrates a central point: small differences in what you work on, where you apply your effort, and how much leverage sits behind your decisions can produce massive differences in outcomes. Naval gives another example. So he says, imagine someone comes along who demonstrably has slightly better judgment. They're right 85% of the time instead of 75%. You'll pay them $50 million, $100 million, $200 million, whatever it takes, because 10% better judgment steering a $100 billion ship is very valuable. CEOs are highly paid because of their leverage. Small differences in judgment and capability get really amplified. And that's the point I'm trying to hammer home. When you have leverage, your judgment becomes incredibly valuable. It also means that you have to choose your opportunities wisely because you do not have time to do everything. All else being equal, a higher leverage opportunity will usually be more valuable than a lower leverage alternative. Now, I want to talk about leverage in business models a little bit. So, using the mental model of leverage has really helped me understand great businesses because the best businesses usually utilize leverage intelligently within their business models. So, consider a classic consulting business. So, if the firm wants to take on more projects, it generally needs to hire more consultants. Revenue can grow, but the number of people required to deliver the service also has to grow. A restaurant has a similar limitation. If it wants to serve more customers, it usually needs more cooks, servers, managers, equipment, and physical space. Some business models are inherently dependent on hiring more people in order to deliver more of the product or service. That does not mean they are a bad business, but scaling them can become complicated. As you hire more people, you have to find them, train them, manage them, and coordinate their work. Each additional employee creates more output, but also more complexity. Now, consider some sort of manufacturing business. A manufacturer still uses people and capital to make products, but it can also gain leverage through machinery, economies of scale, improved processes, automation, and better utilization of its factories. Finally, consider a software company. A software company can spend a large amount of time and money building a product, but once the product exists, the marginal cost of distributing another copy can be extremely low. The company can potentially distribute the same product to thousands or millions of customers without increasing its workforce at the same rate as its customer base. Again, this is not to say that a consulting firm or a restaurant cannot be a great business. They absolutely can be. The point is that mental models help you understand the differences between business models. They help you recognize what drives growth, where complexity enters the system, and what might eventually constrain the business. Leverage is one of the many mental models you can use to analyze those differences. And do not be afraid to get granular with it. There are many ways to increase leverage by systematizing work and changing processes. For example, a consulting firm can increase leverage by having junior associates work underneath experienced consultants. The junior associates can perform more of the research, analysis, preparation, and other time-consuming work. That allows the experienced consultants to spend more time in front of clients, solving high-level problems, winning new business, and working on the decisions where their judgment is most valuable. The junior associates learn from the senior people, the senior consultants are freed up to focus on higher value work, and the firm might be able to improve its margins and unit economics. That is leverage being created inside a business that at first glance may not appear especially scalable. Now I'm going to talk about the 3 forms of leverage from the book. So the book broadly discusses 3 forms of leverage: people, capital, and technology, especially things like code and media. People leverage is the oldest form of leverage. So that means you convince people to work with you because you promise them some type of reward. A manager can increase the output of their own judgment by coordinating the work of a team. The next form is capital leverage. People give you money to allocate or invest. The more capital you manage, the more valuable your judgment becomes. If you're making decisions about $100,000, a 10% improvement is useful. If you're making decisions about $10 billion, a 10% improvement is worth an enormous amount of money. Now, the third form is technology leverage. You create something that can be reproduced and distributed at scale, like software, code, media, or digital content. You might spend years developing the judgment and knowledge required to create it, but once it exists, it can reach an enormous number of people. The core idea behind all 3 forms is the same. Leverage amplifies judgment. And there's a positive feedback loop between learning mental models and gaining leverage. Learning mental models helps you make better decisions. Better decisions can earn you more responsibility, resources, trust, capital, and influence. Those things give you more leverage. Then that leverage further amplifies the quality of your decisions. You can also combine multiple forms of leverage. Company is often a combination of all 3. It manages people, deploys capital, and uses technology to distribute a product or service. Now, something I want to get into also is that a big theme of this podcast is that you always have to consider where you might be wrong, where you might be led astray. You always have to remain skeptical. So I need to touch on this point a little bit too regarding leverage, is that leverage amplifies the downside too. This brings us to an extremely important point that leverage itself is neutral. It does not automatically produce a good outcome. It simply amplifies the outcome produced by the decisions behind it. If you make a good decision and place leverage behind it, the results can be massive. But if you make a bad decision and place leverage behind it, the consequences can also be massive. Think about a trader managing an enormous book of business who gets wiped out by a market crash they never saw coming. Or think about a manager who sets the wrong incentives for a customer service department and then watches customer churn increase rapidly across the entire company. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was that the judgment behind the system was wrong. You always have to be conscious of the downside in the worst case scenario. You've probably heard the phrase, there is no free lunch, and leverage is no exception. Every new system, process, employee, piece of machinery, or source of capital comes with costs and trade-offs. Suppose a company wants to make its factory more efficient by buying an expensive new fleet of machines. Those machines might dramatically increase production capacity, but the company still needs enough customer demand to justify the expense. If the demand never arrives, the leverage created by the machinery may turn into a liability. The company is left with high fixed costs, unused capacity, and equipment it cannot justify. And I think this is a good time to bring this up. The real estate mogul Sam Zell had a quote that captures this way of thinking. Basically, he says, listen, business is easy. If you got low downside and a big upside, you go do it. If you've got a big downside and a small upside, you run away. The only time you have any work to do is when you have a big downside and a big upside. Always be aware of the downside. Always be aware of that asymmetry. Leverage can increase your upside, but it can also increase your exposure to being wrong. Now, I want to talk a little bit about leverage and wealth, and this is a big point the book harps on. The reason the book spends so much time discussing leverage is that leverage is essential to building wealth. You are unlikely to become truly wealthy by renting out your time. There's a limit to how many hours you can work. If you need to be physically present and actively performing a task every time you earn money, then your income will always be constrained by your time. You may still earn a very good living, but you don't have the freedom that comes from owning assets that can continue producing value while you sleep. Again, going back to the original idea, you need systems, assets, or businesses that act as force multipliers for your judgment. Essentially, this means you need ownership. You can buy ownership in businesses through the stock market, and that works well, but participating in the stock market at a truly massive scale requires a large amount of capital. You either need to begin with a lot of money, build up a lot of money over time, or convince other people to trust you with their capital. If you can do that and you enjoy it, then great. But for many people, building significant wealth means starting or owning some part of a business. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to create a venture-backed technology startup or anything like that. There are many different types of businesses, organizations, and ownership structures. But if you want to become truly wealthy, you generally need to own something that can grow beyond the number of hours you personally work. So, how do you acquire leverage? You take risks, and you take on increasing amounts of responsibility. Doing that creates two important effects. First, it signals to people with more resources that you are competent and that you know what you're doing. If you repeatedly take responsibility and produce good results, people will be more willing to give you larger projects, more capital, more authority, and more opportunities. That creates another positive feedback loop. You take responsibility, you make good decisions, people trust you with more leverage, then your decisions matter even more. So take on that project at work. Start the side project you've been thinking about. Share what you're building. If you are working inside a traditional organization, make sure there is some visibility into the work you're taking on and the results you're producing. If you're building something independently, distribute it. Share it through YouTube, X, a blog, a newsletter, or your own website, exactly like I'm trying to do now. Sharing your work also has the added benefit of attracting like-minded people. If you make content for smart and ambitious people, then smart and ambitious people are more likely to become part of your audience. Of course, starting your own business, nonprofit project, or organization is inherently risky. There's no guarantee of success. You may need to work extremely hard, make sacrifices, and continue for a long time without knowing whether it will work. But if you are successful and retain ownership in something valuable, the upside can be enormous. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the connections to other mental models. So, really, leverage shows up everywhere. It helps create power law dynamics and winner take most outcomes. It connects to Nassim Taleb's discussions of scalability and nonlinear consequences. It also connects directly to the 80/20 principle. In simple terms, the 80/20 principle is the idea that a minority of causes often produce a majority of the outcomes. There's a commonly repeated story that Vilfredo Pareto noticed a similar pattern in the distribution of peas produced by the pea pods in his garden. He also observed extreme inequality in the ownership of land and wealth. In sales, you might find that 20% of your accounts generate 80% of your pipeline. In a business, 20% of the products might generate 80% of the profits. In your own work, a small number of decisions may create the majority of your results. This connects back to leverage because you should constantly be asking, what is the most effective action I can take right now that will disproportionately help me achieve the result I want? That is the type of question the mental model of leverage teaches you to ask. All right, now let's get into the second big idea. So, the second big idea is specific knowledge. Understanding your own specific knowledge can give you a huge advantage in life. And the book describes specific knowledge as what feels like play to you, but looks like work to other people. What are you uniquely good at? What are you naturally curious about? What type of work can you spend hours doing that another person would find exhausting? Naval says that specific knowledge cannot simply be taught, but it can be learned. You cannot always acquire it by following a standardized curriculum or getting the same credential as everyone else. It is usually developed through a combination of your natural abilities, genuine curiosity, experience, obsession, and the particular problems you choose to pursue. Warren Buffett is a great example. When you look at his life, even when he was young, he was already investing in operating small businesses. He would read the Moody's manuals and financial reports from cover to cover. He would travel to visit companies and ask people questions about how their business worked. It sounds like an enormous amount of work to most people, and it was an enormous amount of work, but I would bet that for Buffett, much of it felt like play. He was genuinely curious about what made a business great. He wanted to understand what made one investment better than another. He devoured annual reports and financial statements because he actually wanted to know what was inside them. Of course, it also goes without saying that Buffett had, he's probably a genius, right? He was incredibly gifted with numbers. His memory was amazing and he was great at analyzing businesses. But that is the essence of specific knowledge. You combine your natural abilities with the subjects that feel like play to you. Because you genuinely enjoy the work, you can continue learning and improving for much longer than someone who is doing it only for money, status, or external approval. Naval puts it this way: specific knowledge is found much more by pursuing your innate talents, your genuine curiosity, and your passion. It's not by going to school for whatever's the hottest job. It's not by going into whatever field investors say is the hottest. This idea, really identifying what captures your curiosity and gives you energy, has come up in almost everything I have read about success. I've seen versions of it in the work of people like Bill Gurley, Paul Graham, and even Michael Jordan. The basic idea is that your work should periodically give you energy. Now, I'm not saying that you need to feel energized every second of the day. Every job, business, and creative project involves some amount of boring work that nobody wants to do, but there will always be administrative tasks, frustration, repetition, and failure. But the core activity should give you frequent infusions of energy, excitement, or curiosity. One useful heuristic associated with Bill Gurley to ask yourself is, what would I rather research or learn about than watch my favorite show on Netflix? What topic pulls you in so deeply that you would choose it over easy entertainment? That question can tell you something about where your genuine curiosity might be hiding. Now, how do you find your specific knowledge? The answer from the book is that you have to try things. You have to iterate. You cannot sit in a room and perfectly reason your way towards your life's work. You need exposure to different industries, projects, skills, people, and problems. Pay attention to what gives you energy. Pay attention to what comes naturally to you. Pay attention to the things other people regularly ask you for help with. And do not be afraid to think outside the box. Try becoming extremely specific and niche with your work. Break different skills and ideas apart, then recombine them in new ways. Often specific knowledge is not one isolated talent, is a unique combination of several abilities, interests, and experiences. Maybe you're not the best writer in the world, the best salesperson in the world, or the best software engineer in the world, but perhaps you are unusually good at understanding technology, communicating clearly, building relationships, and explaining complicated products to business leaders. That particular combination may be far more valuable than being slightly better at only one of those skills. Your combination is much harder to copy because it was shaped by your particular interests and experiences. Once you begin to identify your specific knowledge, you go all in. You bet heavily on it. You build your skills until you become trusted to solve important problems and bring your own judgment and taste to difficult decisions. And this leads to another phrase from Naval: productize yourself. Build specific knowledge until you can solve a valuable problem in a way that is distinctively yours. Then combine that knowledge with leverage so that the value you create can reach more people. To productize yourself, you need both leverage and differentiation. And that leads directly into the third big idea. And that third big idea is authenticity and differentiation. Naval says, escape competition through authenticity. Just think about that. Escape competition through authenticity. This is easily one of the most impactful sentences I've ever read. The subject of competition is always front and center. How are you going to get ahead of the competition? How are you going to beat the competition? How are you going to become better than everyone else? Look, there is nothing wrong with being competitive. Competitiveness can be extremely useful mindset. It can push you to work harder, improve your skills, and refuse to settle. But competition can also become a trap. I'm talking about this in more of a psychological or even spiritual sense, whatever you want to call it. Always focusing on the competition is exhausting. Constantly watching other people, measuring yourself against them, and reacting to their every move sounds miserable. Think about a commodity business. A commodity business has to keep its competitors front and center. The product is difficult to differentiate, so the company constantly has to watch prices, match new offerings, reduce costs, and respond to the competition. If it falls too far behind, it gets killed. Running that kind of business can be extremely difficult because the company has very little freedom. It is forced to react. Now think about how many people apply that same mentality to their personal lives. They are always trying to beat another person, catch another person, or prove that they are better than another person. Again, this mindset can sometimes push you towards success, but do you really want to chase success at the cost of your own happiness, relationships, and peace of mind? Do not make yourself miserable. So, the natural question becomes, how do you stay ambitious and motivated without constantly obsessing over the competition? One answer is to try to escape competition entirely. Differentiate yourself so effectively there is no direct competition. There's only what you are uniquely talented and motivated to do. Bill Gurley gives an example that illustrates this idea. So, suppose you're someone who genuinely loves to learn and you're interviewing for a position in an industry that deeply captures your curiosity. Because you're actually interested in the industry, you research its history. You study the major companies, the founders, the business models, the products, the important turning points. You do not do that only because someone told you to prepare for the interview. You do it because you actually want to understand the industry. Now consider how competitive the process of applying and interviewing for a job can be. You may be competing against dozens or hundreds of other candidates. But if you enter the interview with a deep understanding of the industry and can clearly articulate what you have learned, you immediately become more differentiated. You stand out. Not because you spent the entire process thinking, how do I beat every other candidate? You stand out because you leaned into your authentic curiosity and allowed it to take you further than most people are willing to go. And that is the central idea. As you lean into your authentic interests, abilities, passions, and curiosities, differentiation becomes a natural byproduct. You are no longer trying to become a slightly better copy of someone else. You're building a combination of knowledge, skills, experiences, and taste that belongs specifically to you. Nobody else has your exact combination. And because the work genuinely interests you, other people may not be able to match your effort over a long period of time. They may be able to force themselves to work harder for a month. They may even do it for a year, but it's difficult to compete over decades with someone who genuinely enjoys the game. So it's not about saying, am I going to beat everyone else? It's about finding the areas where you are naturally curious, where you have unusual abilities, and where the process itself feels meaningful to you. Then you can keep developing those qualities until you become increasingly difficult to compare with anyone else. That is how authenticity helps you escape competition. The idea of differentiation is one that will come up again and again throughout this podcast because I think it is essential to success in almost any domain. You want to be differentiated, like Peter Thiel says. You want to own a category of one. I do not care whether you apply that idea to your personal life, your business, or your job. Find a way to differentiate yourself because differentiation is one of the most powerful ways to get ahead and go far. Now let's really dig into differentiation in business. Charlie Munger, talking about investing, said, "We have to have a business with some inherent characteristics that give it a durable competitive advantage. Differentiation leads to competitive advantage. The business has something that separates it from everyone else. It has some characteristic that competitors cannot easily recreate, buy, or copy." There are so many examples from the lore and honestly almost the mythology of Berkshire Hathaway where Buffett and Munger invested in businesses because those businesses possessed something unique. Maybe it was an incredibly powerful brand. Maybe it was enormous economies of scale. Maybe it had unassailably low costs. Maybe it owned a distribution network, reputation, customer relationship, or position in the market that would be incredibly difficult for another company to reproduce. Whatever the particular advantage was, they were always looking for something different. They were not simply looking for a business that did the same thing as every other company but did it slightly better that year. They wanted a business with characteristics that gave it a lasting reason to win. Think about the greatest brands in the world, or think about the greatest artists. Could someone else truly recreate what they have? A competitor might be able to imitate the product. Another artist might be able to copy the style, but copying the surface is not the same as recreating the entire system underneath it. The history, trust, reputation, talent, relationships, culture, and accumulated knowledge that make it valuable in the first place. Coca-Cola is a classic example. Warren Buffett has made the point that even if you gave someone an extraordinary amount of money, like $100 billion or something like that, they still could not simply recreate Coca-Cola's position in the mind of the consumer. You could build factories, you could develop a similar drink, you could buy advertisements and place the product in stores, but you cannot instantly recreate more than a century of brand recognition, customer habit, distribution, cultural association, and trust. That is differentiation. And the strongest differentiation is usually not based on only one thing. It comes from several advantages reinforcing one another. The brand strengthens the distribution. The distribution puts the product in front of more people. More customers strengthen the company's scale. Greater scale can reduce costs and fund more marketing. Then the stronger brand, lower costs, and wider distribution make the company even harder to compete against. It becomes a feedback loop. This is where differentiation becomes a durable competitive advantage rather than just a clever marketing message. Saying that your product is different is not enough. The difference has to matter to the customer, and ideally it has to be difficult for competitors to reproduce. That is true for a business, and it's also true for an individual. What is the combination of skills, knowledge, relationships, reputation, and judgment that makes you difficult to replace? What can you do that creates meaningful value but cannot be easily copied by the next person who walks through the door? That is the personal version of a competitive advantage. So when I say that you should escape competition through authenticity, I do not mean that competition disappears completely. There will always be other companies, candidates, creators, and people trying to succeed. The point is that you should stop competing only on the dimensions where everyone else is competing. Do not become another commodity. Build something distinctive enough that the comparison becomes less direct. And that is how the three ideas connect. Specific knowledge helps you identify what is uniquely yours. Authenticity helps you differentiate it. Leverage allows you to scale it. You develop knowledge and judgment that are difficult to copy. You apply them in a way that's genuinely your own. You then use people, capital, technology, or some combination of the three to amplify the value you create. As I was going through each of these ideas, I briefly touched on how all three connect. But when you really combine leverage, specific knowledge, and authenticity, you begin to create a flywheel where each idea strengthens the others. You can also get what Charlie Munger would call a Lollapalooza effect. Munger used that term to describe the extra powerful effects that can emerge when several important forces all begin working in the same direction. The flywheel describes how the ideas reinforce one another. The Lollapalooza effect describes the disproportionate outcome that can result when they all come together. And I think this is important because we often want to reduce success to one cause. Someone became successful because they worked hard. A company succeeded because it had a great product. An investor succeeded because they were intelligent. But the world is rarely that simple. In complex systems, exact causation is incredibly difficult to determine. There are usually hundreds or thousands of variables interacting with each other. That does not mean we cannot understand anything. It means we should be careful about telling overly simple stories. Even when we cannot identify one exact cause, we can often identify 3, 4, or 5 major forces that work together to produce an enormous outcome. And when you combine leverage, specific knowledge, and authenticity, either at a personal level or at an organizational level, you have 3 extremely powerful forces moving in the same direction. And that can create something special. And before I explain how, there's one thing I want to say about outcomes and results. Naval has a great line. It is impatience with actions, patience with results. The basic idea is that you should act quickly on the things you can control, but remain patient about when the results will arrive. Naval makes the point that results often depend on complex systems involving markets, products, other people, timing, and many variables outside your direct control. So, get started, take action, do the work, but do not assume you can perfectly control the timeline. It is easy to become obsessed with results and constantly ask, when is this finally going to work? But the world is complicated, and it's incredibly difficult to know exactly when a market will adopt a product, when an audience will find your work, or when years of effort will finally begin to compound. So, focus on the process. Keep your head down and continue working. But I digress. So, let's connect the 3 ideas. You begin with your specific knowledge. This is the work that looks difficult to other people but feels like play to you. It is the combination of your natural abilities, genuine curiosity, experiences, and skills that is difficult for someone else to recreate. Because the work genuinely interests you, you naturally spend more time thinking about it. You read more, you experiment more, you ask better questions. You continue working on it long after another person would have become bored and moved on. That is specific knowledge. And because that work is an authentic expression of who you are, of what interests you and how you naturally think, the product of that work is more likely to be differentiated. You are not merely copying what someone else is doing. You are bringing your own experiences, tastes, judgment, and curiosity to the problem. That makes your work harder to compete with. Then you take the product of your specific knowledge and place leverage behind it. You use people, capital, technology, or some combination of all 3 to distribute it at scale. Specific knowledge gives you something valuable to offer. Authenticity makes it different and difficult to copy. Leverage allows it to reach far more people than you could ever reach through your time alone. That is the flywheel. And once those 3 forces begin reinforcing one another, results can become nonlinear. Your specific knowledge improves the quality of your work. Better work earns attention, trust, resources, and opportunities. Those resources gives you greater leverage. Greater leverage distributes your work to more people. A larger audience gives you more feedback, information, relationships, and opportunities to improve your specific knowledge. Then the cycle repeats. Now, none of this guarantees that you will create influence or wealth. You still need good judgment. You still need to create something people actually value. Timing matters. Luck matters. The market matters. And leverage, as we discussed earlier, can amplify bad decisions just as easily as it amplifies good ones. But combining these 3 ideas gives you a far better chance of creating something meaningful and valuable. Now, to really paint the picture, I want to go through some sort of final example. And I'm going to use Mr. Beast actually as an example of combining all 3 ideas. So, easily one of the best examples of these ideas working together is Jimmy Donaldson, better known as Mr. Beast. A lot of this example comes from Bill Gurley's book, Running Down a Dream. So give credit to Bill. That's where I got the idea for this example. But Donaldson started making YouTube videos when he was extremely young and spent years uploading videos with very little traction. During that period, he became completely obsessed with understanding YouTube. He studied pacing, he studied thumbnails, he studied titles, he studied audience retention, he studied why one video became viral while another video disappeared. This was not casual interest. This was the type of obsession that would look completely unreasonable to most people. But that is exactly the point. Most people would never spend years studying YouTube videos at that level because to them, it would feel like miserable work. To Donaldson, it was fascinating. That is specific knowledge being developed through genuine curiosity. Eventually, he found a small group of other creators who were just as obsessed as he was. They began holding long Skype calls where they would analyze successful videos, compare data, and give each other blunt feedback and break down tiny details like thumbnail design, camera cuts, titles, storytelling, and viewer retention. Accounts of this period describe daily mastermind-style conversations that continued for roughly 1,000 days, sometimes lasting from early morning till late at night. Think about how unusual that is. They were not simply saying, we need to work harder than everyone else. They were deeply curious about the subject. They enjoyed studying it. They found other people who shared that obsession. And because they were genuinely fascinated by the problem, they developed knowledge that most creators did not have. They also brought different strengths to the group. One person might have understood storytelling better. Another person might have been better at thumbnails. Someone else might have noticed patterns in pacing, titles, or audience retention. They shared what they learned and allowed their knowledge to compound collectively. Again, this is authenticity and specific knowledge working together. They were developing capabilities that were extremely difficult to teach through a normal class or standardized career path. They were learning by doing, analyzing, failing, and sharing information and iterating relentlessly. Then comes leverage. Donaldson was creating videos that could be distributed through YouTube to an enormous number of people. He did not have to perform the videos separately for every viewer. He could invest his time, creativity, and capital into making one piece of content, and the platform could distribute that same piece of content to millions of people. That is technology leverage. Then, as his channel grew, he added other forms of leverage. He built a team that gave him people leverage. He reinvested increasingly large amounts of money into his videos. That gave him capital leverage. He used software and internet platforms to distribute his work globally. That gave him technology leverage. And all of those forms of leverage began reinforcing one another. Better videos attracted a larger audience. A larger audience generated more revenue. More revenue allowed him to make more ambitious videos. More ambitious videos attracted an even larger audience. The audience that gave him the ability to launch additional channels, products, and businesses. It became a flywheel. But none of that leverage would have been nearly as powerful without the specific knowledge underneath it. Giving someone a large production budget does not mean they know how to make a great YouTube video. Giving someone a large team does not mean they know how to hold an audience's attention. The leverage amplified Donaldson's judgment, but that judgment was built through years of obsessive study. And his authenticity mattered because very few people would genuinely want to live that way or spend that much time thinking about YouTube. His obsession was difficult to fake. So the Mr. Beast example shows how all three ideas can combine. He developed specific knowledge by obsessively studying YouTube. That obsession was an authentic expression of what naturally interested him. Because it was authentic, he was able to continue far longer and go much deeper than most people. Then he placed enormous amounts of leverage behind that knowledge through media, technology, people, and capital. The result was not merely additive, it was nonlinear. That is the Lollapalooza effect. Several powerful forces combined and began reinforcing one another, creating an outcome far larger than any one of those forces could have created alone. All right, now for a recap. So, in this episode, we talked about three ideas from the Almanack of Naval Ravikant: leverage, specific knowledge, and authenticity. Like every mental model, these ideas are supposed to help you make better decisions. Use leverage, specific knowledge, and authenticity when you are evaluating the options in front of you, but also use them when you're trying to create entirely new options. Ask yourself, where's the leverage in this situation? What could multiply the output of my time, effort, capital, or judgment? What knowledge do I have or could I develop that is difficult for someone else to copy? What feels like play to me but looks like work to other people? And how can I approach this problem in a way that is authentically mine rather than becoming a copy of what already exists? Be creative in how you apply these ideas. They can help you think about your career, your business, your investments, your creative work, and the projects you choose to pursue. But do not apply them blindly. Mental models are tools. They are not laws that automatically produce the correct answer. You still have to think deeply about the specific decision in front of you. You have to consider the context, the trade-offs, the downside, and the possibility that you might be wrong. Point of a mental model is not to eliminate judgment, to improve your judgment. Specific knowledge helps you discover what is uniquely yours. Authenticity helps you differentiate it. Leverage allows you to amplify it. And when all three begin working together, they can create extraordinary outcomes. I hope you find these ideas useful, and as always, thank you for listening.